A phone rings. Trump answers, listens quietly, and then slams it down. Scott Bessent didn't just threaten China, he threatened Europe. Not with tanks, not with embargoes, but with math. His warning? Any country purchasing Russian oil routed through China will face a 100% secondary tariff. And this wasn't whispered in back rooms. It was declared on CNBC, broadcast directly from the US Treasury. In a single statement, Bessent didn't just escalate tensions with Beijing, he challenged the global energy order. Now it's not just about China, it's about India, Germany, the G7, and every country threading their energy needs through China's expanding industrial grid. 8 hours later, Tibet roared to life. The Yarlung Tsangpo River surged as 5 synchronized hydroelectric dams fired up simultaneously. Over 300 million megawatt-hours came online, triple the output of China's iconic Three Gorges Dam. Bloomberg reported that this one network now produces more clean energy than all of Poland combined. This wasn't a coincidence. This was choreography. A geopolitical sanctions threat answered with a geoelectric counterstrike. And while Washington brandished tariffs, Beijing threw the switch. China now imports roughly 2.2 million barrels of Russian oil daily, according to Reuters, a 16% spike year over year. Imports from Iran, also under US sanctions, have quietly risen too. And Beijing isn't hiding any of this. It's expanding it. But from Bessent's podium, this isn't legal trade, it's complicity. He draws a straight line. Sanctioned oil flows into China, then Chinese chips flow out to the world. To him, that's not commerce, it's coordination. And now, he wants Europe on board. But here's the paradox. Washington says it's defending global rules by threatening those very same rules. China, in contrast, has made its position plain. In a formal response to the South China Morning Post, China's embassy in Washington called US sanctions illegally extraterritorial. According to Beijing, its trade with Russia and Iran complies with international law, and no third country suffers as a result. The logic is legally defensible, but it's not immune to criticism. Energy is fungible. Oil sent to China can free up unsanctioned supply for others, indirectly supporting sanctioned regimes. Still, the principle of sovereign trade, ironically, is the exact one Washington leans on when justifying its own arms deals. Here's where the squeeze tightens. Bessent isn't just focused on direct trade. He's now lobbying for G7 unity to cut China off more broadly by pressuring allied supply chains, not just sanctioning Beijing, but threatening France, Italy, and Germany if they continue engaging economically with it. According to the Wall Street Journal, the EU exports over $67 billion in vehicles and another $130 billion in pharmaceuticals and metals to the US every year. In comparison, the US only sends $70 billion back. But China isn't shipping everything straight to America anymore. According to Bloomberg Economics, 70% of Chinese exports to the US are now routed through third countries, Vietnam, Mexico, even Canada. These rerouting tactics disguise the original source, slipping Chinese goods under non-Chinese labels. So what's Bessent's new idea? Blanket tariffs. Entire countries, not just Chinese goods, get taxed if they don't police Chinese content. If implemented, this could hit over 2.1% of China's GDP, but it wouldn't stop there. It would drag US allies like Japan, Korea, and Mexico into the economic crossfire. And the blowback? Global supply chains could start to fracture, not from explosions, but from import forms and port paperwork. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that US consumers have already paid billions extra under Trump-era tariffs. That revenue may fill treasury coffers, but it comes directly out of everyday American wallets. Which brings us to a second contradiction. Tariffs sold as protection for American industries often just hurt American demand. A 30% import tax on Chinese goods might sound tough, but Financial Times reporting makes it clear consumers, not Chinese exporters, shoulder the cost. Meanwhile, Trump's newest tax plan? According to the nonpartisan CBO, it would add $3.4 trillion to the U.S. deficit over the next decade. Corporate taxes drop, wealthy households benefit, but the costs? Cuts to Medicaid, food assistance, and green energy incentives. 10 million Americans could lose health coverage by 2034. Let's hit reset. The U.S. is demanding China stop buying oil from nations the U.S. itself can't control. To enforce that, it threatens its own allies, those same countries it depends on to contain Beijing. And all the while, China builds. In the mountains above Sichuan, an underground facility is now producing over 6,000 tons of polysilicon per month, the critical ingredient for solar panels. This single site now outpaces the entire production of the U.S. solar industry, And who's financing it? Not just Beijing. Goldman Sachs and BlackRock, two of America's biggest investment firms, have quietly increased their positions in Chinese clean tech. And it's not just solar. Chinese EV battery makers like CATL and BYD now supply nearly 60% of the global market, up from 25% just 4 years ago. Their lithium chains run from Bolivia to Congo, stitched together with state-backed logistics and private capital. Meanwhile, in Washington, the House is pushing a bill to ban Chinese EV batteries entirely. But here's the problem. Without those batteries, U.S. car makers grind to a halt. Ford's $3.5 billion battery plant in Michigan, powered by cattle technology, remove that and the facility becomes a shell. In fact, China has spent the last decade not just building supply chains, but owning them. From Indonesian nickel mines to African cobalt to Latin American lithium, Beijing doesn't just trade in resources, it finances the roads, ports, and refineries that move them. Now enter the tariffs. The Biden administration has quietly increased duties on 500-plus Chinese goods, especially in green tech, biotech, and semiconductors. But here's the problem. Most of the core inputs still come from Chinese firms, even if the final assembly happens in Vietnam or Mexico. What Washington calls de-risking, Beijing calls containment. Last quarter, China added 142 gigawatts of solar capacity, enough to power the entire UK. That's more clean energy in 3 months than the US installed in 5 years. Simultaneously, China doubled its fiber optic cable exports, saturated Southeast Asia with 5G infrastructure, and rolled out a satellite-backed Beidou navigation expansion, challenging American GPS. But back in Washington, the political logic hasn't changed. If you can't outcompete China, just make China more expensive. That's the real goal of Besant's secondary tariffs, not to stop Chinese exports altogether, but to inflate their costs globally until they lose their price advantage. Those inflated prices don't just hit China, they hit anyone using Chinese parts. That includes U.S. allies, U.S. factories, and U.S. consumers. Meanwhile, China isn't retaliating with tanks or sanctions. It's retaliating with speed. In just 2 years, China built 17 new rare earth processing facilities and now controls over 85% of global refining capacity. If it wanted to choke off the West's access to high-performance magnets tomorrow, it could. So now the U.S. faces a dilemma. Push harder, and you risk a fracture with your allies. Pull back, and China keeps racing ahead. The real battle isn't just economic, it's philosophical. China believes in state-guided capitalism, a model where markets serve national strategy. The U.S. still clings to private-led capitalism, where strategy is whatever the free market decides. And while the Pentagon warns about Chinese drones, American firms keep importing them by the crate because they're cheaper. And China builds. Right now, America is leaning heavily on tariffs, tools designed for a 20th century economy, to solve a 21st century power shift. A 2024 study by the Peterson Institute shows that U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods raised domestic prices by up to 14%, while Chinese retaliation slashed U.S. farm exports by billions. In other words, America is bleeding twice, once at the port and again at the checkout counter. In swing states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, voters are demanding action, especially those in manufacturing towns hollowed out over the past 20 years. For them, tariffs aren't just economic, they're emotional. A last stand for an industry they watched disappear. But tariffs are reactive, not strategic. They punish, they don't rebuild. In 2025, China will outspend the U.S. 3-to-1 on industrial policy. It's not just solar or semiconductors, it's AI, quantum computing, biotech, robotics, whole industries being shaped before they even mature. President Xi Jinping's most recent 5-year plan openly declares technology as the core battlefield of global competition and calls for state-led breakthroughs across 35 sectors. Meanwhile, the U.S. debates budget ceilings and regulatory red tape. By the time legislation clears Congress, China's already shipped version 2. Now, U.S. intelligence warns that China's edge in hypersonics and drone swarms could shift the battlefield balance. But that didn't come from nowhere. It's the result of a decade-long fusion between the People's Liberation Army and private tech firms. The U.S., by contrast, still separates Silicon Valley from the Pentagon, with one chasing user growth and the other chasing votes. While tariffs try to block Chinese goods at the border, American investors keep funding Chinese innovation from the inside. through venture capital, equity swaps, and joint ventures that blur the line between friend and rival. One path leads to deeper decoupling, more tariffs, more bans, and a fractured global economy split along geopolitical lines. The other path? Competition by construction. That means reindustrializing not by nostalgia but with direction. State-backed factories, strategic subsidies, real industrial strategy. Because the truth is, if America doesn't start building again, not just in rhetoric, but in steel, silicon, and software, then the tariffs won't matter. By the time we wake up, China will already be on to the next wave. If you found this video valuable, give it a like and subscribe for more. Also, for more coverage of US-Canada trade news, subscribe to our channel and click the bell to be the first to hear the news.